She was 20 years old and left for dead in the Dakota Badlands. She had no family left to claim her, no money to speak of, just a worn brass compass and the clothes on her back. And with nothing, she dragged herself into a collapsed smuggler's dugout along the Missouri Breaks, a place forgotten by time and man. But what nobody knew, least of all her, was that beneath the rotted floorboards was a sealed iron strongbox and a coded ledger that would change her life forever. Settle in with us for this story and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Bess Harlow had been raised on the smell of pine shavings and oiled leather and the quiet competence of men who worked with their hands. Her father, a carpenter and sometime wheelwright, had been a gentle man who believed a well-made joint was a form of prayer, and he had passed that reverence for craft on to his daughter. But he had died of a fever when she was 12, leaving her and her mother with a small, hard-scrabble homestead and a legacy of good tools. Her mother, a practical woman worn thin by grief and hardship, remarried within 2 years. Her new husband was a man named Marcus Thorne, a land speculator with soft hands and a ledger for a heart, and he saw Bess not as a daughter, but as an entry on the debit side of his accounts. The warmth of her childhood home cooled into a place of silent obligation. The only solace she found was in the company of Jedediah Stone, her late grandfather's trapping partner. Jed was a man carved from the western landscape itself, weathered and quiet, and he saw the same steady spirit in Bess that he had valued in her father and grandfather. He took her on his trap lines, teaching her how to read the subtle language of the land, the bent grass that spoke of a deer's passing, the smudge of charcoal that marked an old traveler's fire, the particular blue of the sky that promised a hard frost. He taught her how to use an adze and a draw knife, how to shape a piece of green cottonwood into a functional tool, and how to mend a leather harness with an awl and waxed thread. After her father's funeral, it was Jed who had pressed her grandfather's compass into her hand. It was a heavy brass instrument, its glass face scratched and its casing worn smooth by a thumb that was no longer there. "A good compass never lies, Bess," he had told her, his voice rough as bark. "It'll always show you true north. A person needs that." That compass became her most treasured possession, a tangible link to a love that was unconditional and a past where she had belonged. She learned to be quiet, to be useful, and to make herself small in Marcus Thorne's house. But she carried the compass in her pocket, a cold, solid reminder of her own true north. The end of her life at the homestead came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, the air sharp with the coming winter, when Marcus called her into the small room he used as an office. He did not ask her to sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the land her father had cleared and tilled, and he spoke to the glass rather than to her. "I've sold the property, Bess," he said, his voice flat and administrative. "All of it. A syndicate from the east is buying up the whole valley. The papers were signed this morning." She felt a cold stillness spread through her chest, but her face remained impassive. She had known this was coming, in the way an animal knows the feel of a coming storm. He had been selling off her father's tools one by one, and the livestock had dwindled to a few chickens. "Your mother and I will be taking the train back to Ohio. There are opportunities there." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding a kind of sterile pity that was worse than any anger. "There is no place for you in this new arrangement. You're a woman grown. It's time you made your own way." He slid a small stack of bills across the polished surface of his desk. $20. It was an insult dressed up as a settlement. This should be sufficient to see you to Mandan or another river town. I suggest you find work there. Be gone by sunrise." She did not argue or plead. She did not cry. To do so would have been to give him a satisfaction he did not deserve. She simply nodded once, a short, sharp dip of her chin, and took the money. She turned and walked out of the room, her back straight. In her own small attic room, she packed a canvas sack with a quiet, methodical efficiency taught by Jedediah. Her spare wool shirt, a whetstone, the sharp skinning knife he had given her for her 16th birthday, a small packet of salt, and a length of cordage. She tucked the $20 deep inside. Lastly, she took out her grandfather's compass. She held it in her palm for a moment, the brass cool against her skin, and then slipped it into her pocket. She left before the first hint of dawn, without a word of farewell. She did not look back at the dark shape of the house, the only home she had ever known. She set her face to the west, toward the broken lands and the wide, muddy Missouri, and began to walk. The journey was a crucible. The rolling prairie she had known gave way to a landscape that felt ancient and hostile, a place of carved sandstone spires, steep-sided buttes, and deep, shadowed ravines. The Dakota Badlands were beautiful in their own stark, unforgiving way, but it was a beauty that promised nothing and offered no quarter. The sun was a relentless hammer, and the wind was a thief that stole the moisture from her skin and whispered of solitude in her ears. For 5 days she walked, and the skills Jedediah had taught her were the only things that kept her alive. She found water, not in flowing creeks, but in small, hidden seeps at the base of north-facing cliffs, places where the rock wept just enough to sustain a patch of green rushes. She read the tracks in the dust, giving wide berth to the sinuous trails of rattlesnakes and the heavy prints of a lone buffalo bull. On the 3rd day, she snared a lean jackrabbit, dressing it with her small knife and roasting it over a tiny, smokeless fire of dried sagebrush, the meat tough but life-sustaining. She was competent, but the land was a formidable adversary. The $20 from her stepfather felt like a joke in this immense and empty place. It could not buy her water or shelter. Her boots, stout and well-made by her father's hands years ago, began to fray at the seams. A gnawing exhaustion settled deep in her bones. She was heading for the Missouri River breaks, a rugged maze of canyons and bluffs where she had heard a person could disappear, could stake a claim on a piece of land no one else wanted. It was a desperate hope, a direction offered by the needle of her grandfather's compass. Then the storm came. It rose up from the northwest with shocking speed, a bruised purple wall of cloud that swallowed the sun. The temperature plummeted, and the wind turned into a physical force, tearing at her clothes. A cold, driving rain turned the clay soil into a treacherous grease. She lost her footing on a steep embankment and tumbled down, her canvas sack torn from her grasp and sent spinning into the roiling waters of a flash flood that filled the arroyo below. She watched it go, her spare shirt, her knife, her salt, everything but the compass in her pocket. Soaked, freezing, and now utterly destitute, she understood what Marcus Thorne had truly done. He hadn't just cast her out. He had sent her into this wilderness with just enough to give her the illusion of a chance, sentencing her to a slow, anonymous death. It was then, huddled under a rock ledge as the rain lashed down, that she saw it. Through the gray sheet of rain, she saw a dark opening in the side of a bluff across the ravine, almost perfectly concealed by a thick stand of skeletal cottonwoods. It was little more than a shadow, a place where the earth seemed to have been hollowed out. Hope, or perhaps just the instinct for survival, was a stubborn thing. When the rain lessened to a miserable drizzle, she picked her way across the slick rocks of the ravine and climbed the opposite bank, her muscles screaming in protest. The opening was the entrance to a dugout, an old sod-roofed shelter dug directly into the hillside. It was in a state of near-total collapse. The door, fashioned from thick, hand-hewn planks, had been ripped from its leather hinges and lay half buried in the mud. The sod roof, overgrown with prairie grass, had caved in on the eastern side, leaving a gaping hole to the sky and a pile of earth, tangled roots, and rotted timbers on the floor inside. She peered into the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and the faint, musky scent of pack rats. But it was shelter. It was out of the wind. With a final surge of effort, she crawled through the doorway. The interior was small, no more than 10 feet by 12. The floor was packed earth, uneven and littered with debris. Against the back wall, a crude fireplace had been built from stacked river stones, its hearth choked with old ashes and rubble. A rusted, pot-bellied wood stove lay on its side, its stovepipe a twisted ruin. In one corner stood the frame of a simple rope bed, its timbers gray and crumbling. It was a wreck, a place abandoned to the elements and the slow reclamation of the earth. Anyone else would have seen only ruin, but Bess, looking with the practical eyes Jedediah had given her, saw something else. She saw that the main support beam, a massive cottonwood log spanning the width of the ceiling, was still sound. She saw that the stone fireplace, though messy, was structurally intact. The location itself was well chosen, sheltered from the north wind, south-facing to catch the winter sun, and hidden from casual view. It was a foundation. It was a place that had been discarded, a place no one wanted, and in that, she felt a strange kinship. This broken-down hovel was more of a home than the one she had just been forced to leave. She began to work, her movements slow and deliberate, clearing a small space on the floor with her bare hands, scraping away the debris and rat nests. It was a start. The work of clearing the dugout was slow and arduous. For 2 days, she labored with nothing more than her hands and a stout piece of fallen timber she used as a lever and a scraper. She dragged the collapsed sections of the roof out into the open, sorting the salvageable wood from the rotted debris. She swept the earthen floor, finding beneath the layers of dust and filth an assortment of pathetic remnants from a past life. A bent tin cup, the rusted head of an axe with its handle long since rotted away, a single forlorn boot with a hole in its sole. It was on the 3rd day, as she worked to clear the rubble from the stone hearth, that she made the discovery. The hearth was paved with large, flat stones, fitted together with a surprising degree of care. As she levered one of the larger stones near the back of the fireplace, she felt it shift under her weight with a dull, grinding sound. It was loose. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, cut through her fatigue. Using her wooden lever, she wedged it into the crack and pushed with all her strength. The stone was heavy, but it tilted upwards, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. Her heart began to beat a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. The cavity was lined with oilcloth, still supple and black despite the years, and nestled inside were 2 objects. The first was a small, heavy iron strongbox, about the size of a loaf of bread, its surface pitted with rust, but its construction solid. It had no keyhole, but a complex clasp of interlocking metal tabs. Beside it lay a leather-bound ledger, also carefully wrapped in a protective layer of oilcloth. She reached in and lifted the ledger first. The leather was dry but intact. Untying the cord that held it shut, she opened it to the first page. The script was a neat, precise hand, but the words were a meaningless jumble of letters and numbers. It took her a moment to realize it was a code. Columns of figures, dates, and cryptic abbreviations filled the pages. 12 CRTSWHKYRVDBR 7/18. 4 RFLSDLVDFTB 7/23. It was a record of transactions, a smuggler's logbook. She set it aside and turned her attention to the strongbox. The latch was a puzzle, but after several minutes of careful manipulation, she felt a click. The heavy lid swung open. Inside, nestled in what looked like faded velvet, was a small fortune. Stacks of gold coins, double eagles mostly, glinted in the dim light. She counted them slowly, her hands trembling slightly. There were 25 coins in total, $500. To a girl who had been dismissed with 20, it was an unimaginable sum. Beneath the coins was a small deerskin pouch, heavy for its size. She opened it to find a handful of uncut stones, a few dull-looking diamonds, a rough piece of jade, and what looked like a small, watery blue sapphire. And at the very bottom, sealed in its own oilskin packet, was a letter. She carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the stiff paper. The ink was faded but legible. It began without salutation. "My name is Silas Kane. I built this place in the spring of '58. I ran goods up the Missouri when the Army wasn't looking, and the trading companies were charging too much. It was a hard life, but it was mine. The money in this box is what I saved. It was for my son Thomas, but my partner, a man named Corrigan, betrayed me. I had to run, and I never saw my boy again. I do not know who will find this, perhaps no one. But if you are reading this place and what is in it is now yours. Use it to build a good life, a life of your own making. Do not trust men who value gold more than their word. That is all the advice I have. May you find better fortune than I did." Bess read the letter twice, the simple, direct words echoing in the silent dugout. She felt a profound connection to this man, this stranger from another time. He too had been betrayed. He too had lost everything. He had left behind not just wealth, but a blessing. She looked around at the broken-down shelter, then at the gold in her hands. This wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was an inheritance. With the resources from Silas Kane's strongbox, Bess's world expanded from mere survival to the possibility of a future. She hid the ledger and the majority of the cash deep within the hearth, resealing it with the heavy stone. Taking 3 of the gold coins, she walked the 15 miles to the nearest settlement. A dusty collection of buildings huddled near a ferry crossing on the Missouri called Lantry's Crossing. It wasn't much of a town, just a trading post, a blacksmith shop, a saloon, and a few scattered houses. At the trading post, run by a wary, hawk-nosed man named Amos Lantry, she moved with quiet purpose. She bought an axe with a hickory handle, a crosscut saw, a good adze, a hammer, and a bag of forged nails. She purchased sacks of flour, beans, salt, and coffee, and a slab of bacon. She also bought 2 sturdy pack mules and the rigging for them. Amos watched her, his eyes missing nothing as she paid with a gold double eagle. "Found a prospector's leavings," she said, her voice even, offering the explanation before he could ask the question. He grunted, accepting the coin and the story without comment. In the Badlands, people learned not to ask too many questions about sudden fortune. Back at the dugout, the real work began. Every swing of the axe, every pull of the saw, felt like an act of defiance against Marcus Thorne and the fate he had intended for her. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching but her spirit resolute. The lessons from Jedediah Stone came back to her, not as memories, but as a living knowledge in her hands. She felled several dead-standing cottonwoods, bucking the logs to length for the roof repairs. Using the adze, she squared the timbers, the sharp blade biting into the wood, sending fragrant chips flying. She rebuilt the caved-in section of the roof, laying the new timbers across the main support beam, followed by a dense lattice of willow branches. Then came the sod. She cut thick, heavy bricks of it from the prairie, the roots of the buffalo grass making a tough, fibrous mat. She hauled them on a makeshift travois pulled by one of the mules and laid them in overlapping layers on the roof, grass side down. She repaired the broken door, using planks from her salvage pile and new iron hinges she'd bought from Lantry's. She chinked the gaps in the stone walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass, sealing the dugout against the wind. It was during this time that she first encountered the other residents of the breaks. A woman named Maria Sandoval, a widow who ran a small freighting business with her 2 grown sons, saw her struggling to move one of the larger roof timbers. Maria, a strong, sun-browned woman with kind eyes, stopped her wagon. "That is too much for one," she said, her voice warm. For a fair price, she and her sons used their team to hoist the heaviest logs into place. While they worked, Maria shared a hot stew from a pot she kept on her wagon, and the simple kindness of the meal felt as nourishing as the food itself. A few days later, Caleb Blackwood, the blacksmith from the crossing, rode out to check on some traps he had set. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered man, with soot permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands. He saw her struggling with the broken door on the pot-bellied stove. Without a word, he dismounted, took the heavy iron piece and secured it to his saddle. He returned 2 days later with the door repaired, a new latch forged and fitted. He refused payment. "Good work should have good tools," was all he said, his eyes appraising the neat adze work on her doorframe with a craftsman's respect. Through these small, repeated acts of practical generosity, a community began to form around her, one built not on words, but on shared work and mutual respect. The dugout, once a derelict hole in the earth, was transformed into a home. It was small and rustic, but it was solid, warm, and entirely her own. The new sod roof settled and knitted itself together, becoming a living part of the hillside. The pot-bellied stove, with its repaired door, drew beautifully, filling the single room with a steady, radiating warmth that smelled of dry cottonwood and pine. She built furniture with the skills her father and Jed had taught her. A sturdy table from a single wide plank, a 3-legged stool, and a set of shelves against the stone wall where she kept her supplies in neat rows. She restrung the old bed frame with new rope and stuffed a mattress tick with dry prairie grass, a luxury of comfort after weeks of sleeping on the hard ground. Her life fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of the day. She rose before the sun, her first task to check the snare lines she had set in the surrounding gullies, which often yielded a rabbit or a prairie hen. She spent her days cutting and stacking firewood for the coming winter, hauling water from a spring she had discovered a quarter-mile down the creek bed, and constantly improving her small homestead. She built a small, sturdy corral for the mules and a lean-to for storing hay. The $20 her stepfather had given her was long gone, spent on the first of her supplies. But the gold coins from Silas Kane's box represented a profound security. They were not just money, they were independence. She made trips to Lantry's Crossing every few weeks, one of her mules laden with well-cured pelts to trade with Amos for things she couldn't make or grow herself. She became a familiar, if quiet, presence in the small community. They no longer saw her as a strange girl who appeared out of nowhere, but as Bess from the breaks, a person who worked hard and kept to herself, but was reliable and fair in her dealings. She mended a set of leather harnesses for Maria Sandoval, her stitching with the awl and waxed thread as neat and strong as any man's, and Maria paid her with a young goat that would provide milk. She helped Caleb Blackwood shoe a difficult horse, her calm and steady presence soothing the animal where his strength could not. In the quiet evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, she would study Silas Kane's ledger. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to break the simple substitution cipher. The names and places started to emerge from the jumble of letters. Fort Buford, Standing Rock Agency, and the names of riverboat captains and freight haulers. She recognized one of the names, Corrigan. A man with the same surname now ran a large and prosperous freighting company out of Mandan, a man known for his ruthless business practices. She understood then that the ledger was more than a historical document. It was leverage. It was a form of power, a secret insurance policy against a world that had already tried to discard her once. She had no intention of following in Silas's footsteps, but the knowledge that she held a truth others would want to keep buried was a comfort, another layer of stone and sod insulating her from the cold. The first snow of winter fell silently in the night, and Bess awoke to a world transformed. The harsh angles of the Badlands were softened, blanketed in a pristine layer of white. From the doorway of her dugout, the only signs of life were the plume of smoke rising from her stovepipe and the tracks of a lone coyote that had passed in the night. The air was still and cold and clean. She stood for a long time, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands, and looked out at the quiet landscape. Inside, her home was a pocket of warmth and order. A small fire crackled in the stove, and the room smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the pine boughs she had laid on the floor. Everything in the small space was the product of her own labor, or had been given in a spirit of practical kindness. The smooth, adze-marked surface of the table, the sturdy hinges on the door Caleb had forged, the woven blanket Maria had given her in trade for a dozen mended grain sacks. Her gaze fell upon the small shelf above the hearth. On it sat two objects. One was her grandfather's compass, its brass casing gleaming softly in the firelight. It had guided her here, a constant reminder of a love that had taught her to be self-reliant. Next to it, she had placed one of the uncut stones from Silas Kane's pouch, the small, watery blue sapphire. It was not beautiful in the way a cut gem would be. It was a rough, cloudy stone, but it held its own light. It represented a different kind of inheritance, a gift from a stranger who understood betrayal and had left behind a legacy of hope. The compass and the stone, one from a man who had loved her, the other from a man she would never know. But both had provided her with a true north, a foundation upon which to build her life. She thought of Marcus Thorne, of his cold, dismissive words and the paltry $20 he had thought was the measure of her worth. He had meant to send her out into the wilderness to be erased, to become a forgotten tragedy. But instead, he had sent her here. The $500 in gold, still hidden securely in the hearth, was more than he had likely earned from the sale of her father's land. The independence she had forged with her own two hands was a treasure he could never comprehend. He had tried to take everything from her, and in doing so, had given her the one thing she truly needed, the chance to build a life entirely of her own making, on her own terms. Bess Harlow was 20 years old and had been cast out into the Badlands. She had arrived with nothing but a compass and a memory of how to work. She found a ruined dugout, a place no one wanted, and made it her own. It was the best inheritance she could have ever received. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and rediscovery. If you were moved by Bess Harlow's quiet strength and determination, consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone you know who appreciates the power of starting over. We believe that stories like these remind us of a fundamental truth, and so we leave you with this question to ponder. What abandoned place or forgotten skill in your own life might just hold the foundation for building something new and lasting? We look forward to seeing you again next time.